It all started one evening while I was scrolling through the news on my old iPhone and lazily finishing off a shawarma, my third one. I'd barely eaten all day. I'd been running errands all over town, so by evening I figured I'd earned a decent meal. Yeah, I know, shawarma isn't exactly health food, and I'm not proud of it, but that little food stand was sending out the kind of smell that makes your feet turn on their own. Lord knows why, but I ordered 3 of them and handed over the cash like I was sleepwalking.
My stomach, however, strongly disagreed, and it protested the only way it knew how. The hiccup that came out wasn't just a hiccup. It had passion. It had conviction, like a chant at a protest rally. Peace! Down with corruption!
Meanwhile, on my tiny screen, the president was wrapping up some official event and chatting with the network's favorite political reporter. The reporter launched into another long-winded question. The president listened, nodded, and hiccuped. Not a polite little hiccup either, a good solid one. The kind of hiccup a man commits to completely.
The reporter kept talking, but the president never let him finish. Without the slightest embarrassment, he apologized, mentioned urgent business, and walked away. Right then, I hiccuped again, loud enough to rattle the windows. That's another one of my charming qualities. Once I start hiccuping, there's no stopping me. I looked back at the screen. The president was already walking away with his back to the cameras. And he hiccuped again. A serious one. Of course, they cut that part from the evening news. Who wants footage of a hiccuping president? I forgot about it myself. Didn't think another thing of it. A couple of weeks later, I don't remember exactly, I was sitting in a medical clinic, waiting for my turn, watching the TV mounted on the wall. Same old coverage. The president was meeting with some leader from the Arab world live on television. The prince, maybe, or sheikh. They do dress impressively, but that's not the point. I wanted to see his name on the screen, so I reached into my jacket pocket for my reading glasses. And at that exact moment, the president reached into his own jacket pocket, as if he were about to pull out his prepared remarks. Except the papers were already lying right there on the table in front of him. Once again, I let it slide. Nothing had happened that seemed worth paying attention to. Things really got strange at work. Every Tuesday, we have our staff meeting. You know the kind. Everyone reports impressive progress. Management pretends to be impressed. Somebody gets chewed out. Somebody gets a new assignment. Same routine every week. Then it was my turn. I stood up and, for some reason, I started mumbling. Not presenting, mumbling. Now, don't get the wrong idea. I've been reporting to bosses for 40 years. I know perfectly well how to deliver a report. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what I was actually saying. I calmly informed my coworkers that construction crews in the Orenburg region had completed thousands of new housing units, that the bridge over the Ural River was being rebuilt on schedule. Korlapov tugged at my sleeve. People started looking at each other. My boss just stared at me, completely speechless. I was about to move on to the outstanding achievements in patriotic education for local young people, but he finally snapped out of it. Which region did you say, Felix Andreevich?
Just like that, whatever spell I'd been under disappeared. I apologized, somehow managed to give my real report, and the meeting went on. But the whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. Something's wrong with me, I thought. That evening, the news proved I wasn't imagining it. The president had met with the governor of the Orenburg region. Exactly, that same Orenburg region. And there he was, speaking in that flat, measured voice of his, word for word, exactly the way I'd been mumbling at the meeting. The new housing, the bridge, even the patriotic education program, including the part I never got around to saying before my boss interrupted me. So my coworkers didn't really miss anything, as long as they'd watch the evening news.
That was the moment I seriously considered pouring myself a stiff drink. Maybe crunch on a pickle while I was at it. Only one problem. I don't drink. Never have. Didn't even have a bottle in the house. So I had to suffer through the shock completely sober. Eventually, I talked myself into believing it was all just a coincidence. After all, strange coincidences happen. My friend Simon got 3 speeding tickets in exactly the same spot. Our analyst, Valentina, always has an aunt who mysteriously gets sick right around Christmas or Easter. And somehow Valentina always ends up with a few extra days off.
So I convinced myself everything was perfectly normal. Big mistake. Exactly 2 weeks later, at the end of the quarter, we were working ourselves to death. 3 shifts, 2 hands, 1 paycheck. Friday afternoon, I dropped some paperwork off for signatures, wandered into the break room, made myself a cup of coffee, threw together a sandwich. The TV was on. The announcer said the president would soon be meeting live with yet another foreign leader. I sat down. My head felt like it was made of concrete. I don't remember closing my eyes. Next thing I knew, Vera, our secretary, was shaking me awake. She needed to clean out the office refrigerator before the weekend. Otherwise, I'd probably still be sitting there on Monday with my untouched sandwich.
It wasn't until I got home that evening that it hit me. I opened Telegram and saw the headlines. The presidential meeting, the very one I'd planned to watch, had been canceled. No explanation given. Oh, wait just a minute. That's when something finally clicked. I started connecting dots that had no business connecting, going back over every little detail I could remember. And then it hit me. When I'd taken the elevator up to the break room that Friday, my head had gone a little light. There'd been this strange warm wave right behind my breastbone, and those little bells, a faint silver ringing, like tiny sleigh bells drifting through a snowstorm. I kept digging through my memory. Sure enough, the same thing had happened right before that staff meeting. I just hadn't paid attention. I was running late, rushing around like always. The hiccup incident? Who knows? Maybe there'd been something then, too. When you're starving, your body can play all kinds of tricks on you. But at the clinic, yes, I'm almost certain I'd felt it there, too, right before I reached for my glasses. By then, I had a serious suspicion, and before long, it became a conviction. This wasn't a coincidence. Coincidences simply don't stack up like that. Fine, suppose they don't. Then what exactly was I supposed to do about it? Ignoring it wasn't an option. What if this was something real? I couldn't exactly go to a doctor. I'd be halfway to the psych ward before I finished explaining the hiccups. A paranormal expert? Forget it. Half of those guys probably work for somebody. No, I'd have to figure it out myself. So I started with the obvious assumption. Somehow, for reasons completely beyond my understanding, there seemed to be a connection between me and the president. Ridiculous? Absolutely. But it was still a hypothesis, and every hypothesis has to be tested.
I bought a little pocket notebook and carried it everywhere. Then I came up with a few harmless experiments. Whenever the dizziness started, whenever I felt that warm wave, whenever I heard those tiny silver bells, I'd make a beeline for the nearest television. It took a while, but eventually I got lucky. The president was speaking live at the launch ceremony for a new icebreaker. I waited for a pause. Then I smoothed my hair. A second later, the president smoothed his. Interesting. I wrote it down. A minute later, I scratched my nose. My God, he scratched his. One more test. I tugged on my left ear. Almost instantly, maybe a second later, the president reached up and touched his own left earlobe.
That took some digesting. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Somehow, every now and then, an unexplained connection formed between us, which meant that I, an ordinary nobody, could make the most powerful man in the country perform tiny little actions of my choosing. Small things, sure, but who was to say where the limit was? Now that was an interesting thought. The fact that the connection worked both ways didn't bother me in the slightest. People had been influencing my life for 65 years. Bosses, officials, bureaucrats, complete strangers. What's one more? But the idea that I might be able to pull the strings attached to someone else's hands? No. I needed proof, real proof. So I threw myself into my experiments with all the enthusiasm of a scientist convinced he was about to discover something nobody had ever seen before.
Every single experiment worked. Every single time. I got the president to slip a hand into his pocket, fiddle with his pen, give a thumbs up, even scratch one leg with the other foot. Nothing too outrageous. Believe me, it took every ounce of self-control I had not to stick my tongue out during one interview or shake my fist at the television like Khrushchev after another round of sanctions. But one day, I slipped. Another forum, another endless stream of speeches and questions. I felt the signs, the dizziness, the warm wave, the tiny silver bells. I grabbed my notebook and sat down in front of the TV. The president was talking with one of the country's top economic officials. I couldn't stand the guy. Neither could anyone else. The whole country was sick of looking at his face. The two of them kept talking, and I could feel my blood starting to boil. Another minute, and I would have thrown something heavy through the television. I swear I didn't plan it. The words just came out. I can't stand the sight of you, I hissed at the screen. Get out of my sight. The president stopped in mid-sentence. Something changed. His face seemed to age right there before my eyes. Lines appeared around his mouth. The corners of his lips sank. Very quietly, as though every word cost him an effort, he said, "My dear friend, we greatly appreciate everything you've done for the country. Your service deserves the highest recognition." He paused. "However, we found another very honorable position where your talents will be better used." The official looked like he was about to faint. He blinked. Once, twice. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His head started shaking ever so slightly. And then the live broadcast suddenly caught away. I nearly had a heart attack myself. There's a big difference between harmless little tricks and interfering with affairs of state. Picking your nose on live television is one thing. Our foreign minister manages that without telepathy. But this was something else entirely. I figured I was in for the beating of a lifetime. Oddly enough, nothing happened. The political world exploded, of course. Everybody wanted to know what had gotten into the president. He'd never humiliated one of his own officials like that before. But the people? The people loved it. Every whispered conversation I overheard, every rumor, every knowing smile, it all warmed my heart. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely proud of something I'd done. I wasn't a king, I wasn't a hero, but somehow I'd managed to make a whole lot of ordinary people just a little happier. I floated home that evening. A few of the guys from my apartment building were standing outside, talking loudly about the firing. Construction workers. They weren't exactly whispering. What did they have to lose? I unlocked my apartment door and immediately knew something was wrong. The light from the kitchen wasn't falling into the hallway the way it should. Someone was blocking it. Then I caught the smell of unfamiliar cologne. My first thought was to call the police. Before I could reach for my phone, a calm voice came from the kitchen.
There's no need for that, Felix Andreevich. The police won't be necessary. Well, so much for my reward, I thought. My hands started shaking so badly I couldn't even hang my coat on the hook. My palms were soaking wet. Cold sweat ran down my back. I bent down to untie my shoes. Don't bother taking them off, the same voice called out. Come on into the kitchen. Let's have some tea. That was the moment my knees turned to jelly. I gave up on the coat altogether and let it fall onto the floor. Then I walked toward the kitchen on legs that barely belonged to me. 2 men were waiting there. Nothing intimidating about them. The kind of forgettable office workers you pass every day without noticing. Different faces, exactly the same person. Cheap suits, every button fastened. I looked around. They'd already made themselves at home. Tea poured into cups, an open package of cookies, a buttered sandwich, my butter, my cookies, crumbs all over my table, in my kitchen. I filled my lungs, ready to demand who the hell they thought they were. But what actually came out was, "Who are you?" "Dragubov," said the first one. "Shestopolov," echoed the second. Of course, why not? At least they didn't offer to shake hands. That would have been awkward with my sweaty palms. The first one, or maybe the second, I was already losing track, spoke again. "We're from Department C, 3rd Service." Department C? I've never heard of it. "You weren't supposed to," the other man replied. "We're here because of your unusual situation." My head started spinning again. Department C, 3rd Service. What kind of crazy business was this? "Exactly," one of them said, with the faintest hint of a smile. "Crazy business. That's what we call it ourselves." Wait, are you like the men in black? Both men sighed. "Oh, please," one of them said. "Let's not do movie references. This is real life." He stood up. "We're here to take you with us. We'll explain what we can, on the way, within reason." Then he handed me a tiny plastic cup. A splash of amber liquid sat at the bottom. "Valerian, you should calm your nerves." I tossed it back in one gulp, like diving into icy water. A minute later, we were walking down into the courtyard. point A, point B. Where they took me, I couldn't even begin to guess. The van's windows were hidden behind heavy curtains. We made so many turns, I quickly lost all sense of direction, although the roads themselves were surprisingly smooth. During the drive, I pieced together what little I could from their vague answers, meaningful shrugs, non-committal grunts, and the occasional sigh. Apparently, Department C of the Third Service, part of some committee they never actually named, though maybe I wasn't supposed to ask, dealt with unusual phenomena, the paranormal. According to them, the president had developed some kind of contact, a counterpart, a mental relative. You could even call him a psychic twin. At unpredictable moments, a connection formed between the two of them. Either one could influence the other.
And somehow, that mental brother turned out to be me. Lucky me. The two men escorting me hadn't merely discovered the connection, they'd found me. That part bothered me a lot more. To be honest, Felix Andreevich, Shestopolov admitted, tracking you down wasn't easy. He actually smiled. It would have been easier to catch a legendary spy. Then he added, with just a hint of annoyance, "You covered your tracks like a professional." I couldn't get another useful word out of either of them.
Soon we arrived. The van rolled into an underground garage. We took an elevator upstairs. Then they led me into a luxury suite. A bedroom with a bed big enough to land a helicopter on. An elegant living room filled with carved furniture.
A television covering almost an entire wall. A private study. A bathroom with a jacuzzi. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. "Your accommodations, Felix Andreevich," Tregyubov said cheerfully. By now, I could finally tell the two apart. Oh, and one more thing. He pointed to a slim booklet lying on a polished wooden table. "Please read the rules for guests in waiting. And always be prepared." "For what?" I asked. Nobody answered. By the time I'd looked up, both men had already slipped out. The door clicked shut so softly, it was almost polite.
Well, I said to myself, you've really done it this time. And I had. I found myself in a place I could only think of as the sanatorium. According to the booklet, an individual classified as a guest in waiting was permitted to remain anywhere within the perimeter. That was their word. Order meals from a daily menu, enjoy 4 meals a day, watch television, request books from the library, ask for writing materials, and use the fitness center. Simple enough. In return, every guest in waiting was required to follow one fundamental rule. Comply immediately with every request made by the staff. So I complied. They gave me a complete physical, CT scans, enough blood tests to supply a vampire convention. Specialists of every imaginable kind, 20 of them, if not more. Every doctor was unfailingly polite, professional, almost reassuring, which somehow made the whole place even more unsettling. Once the examinations were finally over, the two gentlemen returned. "So, Felix Andreevich," Tregyubov began pleasantly, "how are you finding your stay? Any requests? Any complaints?" "Are you kidding me?" I grabbed the booklet off the table and waved it under his nose. "What do you call this?" He glanced at the cover.
I'd call it the rules for guests in waiting. I assume you've memorized them by now. Well, I'd call them prison rules. Am I under arrest? Not at all, Shestopolov said quickly, raising both hands. So I'm free? I packed as much sarcasm into those 2 words as I possibly could. Absolutely, Trogubov smiled. As free as every other citizen of our country. His tone contained at least as much irony as mine. Wonderful. So I can go for a walk in the park. I'd really like some fresh air. I am afraid that would be difficult under the present circumstances. He looked thoughtfully at the ceiling while he said it. All right, then. There's a new production opening at the Mosovet Theater. I've been meaning to see it. Trogubov sighed. Felix Andreevich, you're a grown man. You surely understand that leaving the perimeter isn't possible. The first hint of irritation crept into his voice. So I am under arrest. Simple logic. No, you're free. Your freedom is merely confined to the boundaries of the perimeter. He smiled patiently, as though explaining arithmetic to a child. And in this case, logic isn't particularly helpful. Then his expression hardened. And let's not have any more unfortunate incidents. Or else, I wanted him to say it. My curiosity had all the survival instincts of a moth flying toward a light bulb. The 2 men exchanged a glance. Shestopolov slowly raised his eyebrows. Or else, he searched for the right words. Well, all sorts of things can happen. I suppose so, I said. Someone might suddenly feel the irresistible urge to dance a little jig. Or maybe do a handstand. I actually could. I was a gymnast when I was young. That landed. Trogubov's face changed. He raised one finger and pointed it at me like the barrel of a pistol. Don't get creative. Guest in waiting. Oh, I'm not being creative. I leaned forward. Tell me, do you know exactly when every contact happens? I stressed the word every. Another look passed between them. That was enough. I'd just learned something important. Finally, Shestopolov cleared his throat and slipped into perfect bureaucratic language. Well then, I believe we've reached an understanding. I hate that expression. You've completed all required examinations. Your quarantine period is coming to an end. So, in the near future, he paused just long enough to sound official. We'll be concluding the current phase of this process. That is all we wish to inform you of. And with that, they withdrew. Leaving me alone once again. Inside, I was boiling. No, worse than boiling. I felt like a pressure cooker with the safety valve welded shut. Not under arrest. Free like every other citizen. Sure. Then, ding, ding. The tiny silver bells. My head began to spin. A warm wave rolled through my chest. Right on schedule. The connection. Right on cue. I took it as a sign. Now. It had to happen now. Yesterday would have been too early. Tomorrow would be too late. Time to turn my greatest weakness into my greatest advantage. Ideas were ricocheting around inside my skull. Then one of them hit the target. Oh, I'll give you something to think about. I clasped my hands behind my back like an old-fashioned prisoner and started pacing around the living room,
head down, shoulders slumped, dragging my feet as though I'd spent 20 years in a labor camp. Round and round the table I went.
The only thing missing was the clank of chains. Fortunately, my imagination supplied the sound. I had no idea whether the president was on live television or not. The TV had no remote. Someone somewhere decided when it came on and when it went dark. At that moment, the screen was black. It didn't matter. I wasn't performing for the cameras. I was venting, protesting. So I kept marching, dragging my invisible chains behind me.
About 5 minutes later, I heard pounding footsteps. Not one person, dozens. It sounded like an entire platoon charging down the hallway. Well, that got their attention. And suddenly I wasn't nearly as brave as I'd been 5 seconds earlier. The door flew open, and there stood my 2 favorite bureaucrats, completely out of breath.
Shestopalov's jacket was twisted halfway around his body. His buttons were fastened wrong. Trogubov had stepped in dog poop somewhere along the way. One of them was practically pleading. "Please stop. Felix Andreevich, please, whatever you're doing, stop. Don't ruin everything." The other had completely lost his composure. "Freeze, you idiot! Stop right there! I'll throw you in solitary!"
That turned out to be the wrong thing to say. I stopped, slowly raised my head.
"Solitary?" I said quietly. "Fine, take me. I'll walk there myself." Then I started toward them, like a bulldozer with no brakes. At that moment, I honestly don't think I would have been afraid of the Terminator. They'd pushed me that far. Solitary? That's your answer to everything. Lock people up, keep them under control. What next? A dungeon? A rack?
I kept advancing. The 2 of them instinctively backed away. Behind them stood an entire line of hospital orderlies. They took one cautious step forward. Too late. There was no stopping me now. Something ancient had woken up inside me. I'd been asleep for 30 years. Now I was wide awake. Ha! I lunged toward the orderlies. The whole line jumped backward. Ha! I barked again. This time they flattened themselves against the opposite wall.
"Where's the exit?" I demanded, looking for Trogubov and Shestopalov. They had vanished. "Who's in charge here? Step forward!" A mountain of a man detached himself from the wall. "You! Take me outside! The rest of you, stay where you are!" For some reason, I knew. They weren't dangerous anymore. The big orderly turned without a word and started walking. I followed, hardly believing any of this was actually working. Door after luxurious door opened in front of us. Freedom seemed to be getting closer. "Yahoo!" I shouted. We marched through one endless corridor after another. Right, left, left again, then right. Without a guide, I realized I'd never find my way out of this place. The endless corridors suddenly opened into a hall so magnificent that my luxury suite now seemed like a dusty storage closet. Polished parquet floors, gold leaf, carved wood, crystal chandeliers, paintings, flowers, vases. The whole place practically begged you to say, "Your Imperial Majesty." The orderly stopped in the middle of the room, turned toward me. "Please wait." He said it so calmly, as though nothing unusual had happened over the last 10 minutes. Then he disappeared through an almost invisible door in the corner.
I still have no idea how a man his size fit through it. Before I could ask a single question, he was gone. All at once, the air seemed to leak out of me, along with every ounce of courage I'd borrowed from imaginary heroes. I collapsed into the nearest armchair. My legs simply gave up. My head was spinning again.
For what felt like the 100th time that week. Mind if I sit down too? I've been on my feet all day. And that's largely your fault, Felix Andreevich. I recognized that voice instantly. How could I not? The whole country woke up to it, ate dinner with it, went to bed listening to it. It was the voice that informed us of every triumph, every achievement, every glorious success. I jumped to my feet. There he was, the president, standing beside another chair, looking at me with an expression that was surprisingly kind, almost sympathetic. Of course. Hello! That was about all I managed. He settled comfortably onto the sofa, rubbed his knees, then massaged his calves with obvious relief. You sit down too. Don't be nervous. They'll bring us some tea. We'll have a chat. There wasn't a trace of anger in his voice. No accusation, no threat. He sounded like the world's most gracious host. So I sat across from him. You certainly kept us busy with your little experiments, he smiled. Especially today's. I actually had to pretend my back went out. A good thing there weren't any foreign guests around. That could have been embarrassing. I'd been preparing for this conversation ever since they brought me to the sanatorium, rehearsing arguments, choosing words, imagining every possible question. And now we were discussing lower back pain. What's wrong with back pain? It's a perfectly respectable illness. I figured I ought to contribute something. He chuckled. No, my dear Felix Andreevich. Then he paused. You know what? Let's drop the formalities. Call me Peter. We're well past that. We're practically family, if not something even stranger. That completely threw me. Calling the president Peter? My brain refused to cooperate. He simply continued as though we'd already agreed. The thing is, back pain isn't presidential. It doesn't project the right image, and frankly, you don't want it either. I frowned. I'm not sure any of us gets to choose our illnesses. Oh? But you chose one for me? He smiled. What if it decided to come back to you instead? At that exact moment, a dull ache spread across my lower back. Nothing terrible, just enough to make me straighten up. He laughed. I'm kidding. The pain vanished. I've been meaning to talk to you for a long time, just never found the time. So, Mr. I caught myself. Peter, you've known about us? This whole thing? For a while? Sooner than you think. Remember the pocket? How could I forget? That had been the second incident. I'd replayed it in my head 1,000 times. The fellows from the third service know their business. Don't let the cheap suits fool you. They spotted the connection that very day. Came straight to me with the report. I've been watching for it ever since. He pulled back his jacket lapel. A tiny LED was sewn into the lining. My little warning light, in case I don't feel the connection myself. He let the lapel fall back into place. Finding you, though, he laughed quietly.
That took them a while. I checked on the progress 4 different times. He grinned. I imagine they were sweating bullets by the end. So, you've got them scared, don't you? I still couldn't quite get used to calling the president Peter. He smiled. To some extent. And that's exactly how it should be. The civil service should fear you and trust you. Your enemies should simply fear you. That's why a president can't go around looking fragile. It sends the wrong message.
I had a feeling I'd just nudged him onto one of his favorite subjects. He looked ready to teach a master class on statecraft. Fortunately, I remembered my own prepared questions. So, let me get this straight. Everybody's supposed to be afraid of you? Not everybody. If you're negotiating with someone, that's different. Each side is simply pursuing its own interests. That's politics. Always has been.
Then I asked the question I'd been saving. Probably the same question millions of people would have asked if they'd ever gotten the chance. So, what about ordinary people? Are they supposed to fear you too? The smile disappeared. He leaned back. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, serious. No, the people should love their president. And they do. Quite consistently, in fact. As he said it, he unconsciously straightened his back, lifted his chin, expanded his chest just a little. He looked like a man posing for an official portrait that hadn't been painted yet. You're serious? How do you know they love you? He hesitated, for the first time since entering the room. What do you mean, how? I'm briefed, constantly. We have polling, sociological studies, public opinion research. And just like that, he climbed onto an invisible podium. For the next 10 minutes, he delivered a speech explaining why the people loved their president, why such love was natural, why it was healthy, why it reflected national unity, and why all available data confirmed it beyond question. The only thing missing was the standing ovation. Apparently, my face made it obvious I wasn't applauding inside. You don't believe me. It wasn't really a question. I tried to dodge it. My lawyer has advised me not to answer that. His expression hardened instantly. The warmth vanished. We're not joking anymore, Felix Andreevich. His voice suddenly sounded like an interrogation scene from an old spy movie. Do you doubt that the people love their president? That was a trap. A simple one. The kind bureaucrats spend entire careers setting for one another. Fortunately, I'd spent 40 years as a bureaucrat myself. So instead of answering, I asked my own question. Why does it matter what I believe? You've got intelligence agencies, security services, pollsters, political analysts, reports, briefings, statistics. You already know the answer, better than I ever could. Something shifted. The interrogator disappeared. The patient, almost fatherly tone returned. You're smarter than I gave you credit for. He glanced at his watch. Well, I've stayed longer than I intended. He stood. So, we understand each other now, don't we, Felix Andreevich? His eyes stayed fixed on mine. He wasn't asking. He was testing the strength of an agreement that both of us already knew rested on very shaky ground. There really isn't any other way. I said it calmly. Maybe that was my best move of the entire conversation.
He nodded once. Good. Then he snapped his fingers. I expect we'll meet again. The great doors swung open. Beyond them, the corridor was packed with aides and attendants. A whisper rushed through the crowd like a military command passing down a line of soldiers. Attention. The beloved leader rose and walked out. The audience was over. We're leaving. The voice came from behind me. I turned around. The head orderly was already there, quietly pointing toward another set of doors. They took me home the same way they brought me in. No windows, no landmarks. Point B, back to point A. Life resumed as though nothing had happened. I went back to work. Oddly enough, nobody asked where I'd been. No questions, no suspicious looks. No one wondered whether I'd been sick. It was as if I'd never disappeared at all. Outwardly, everything was exactly the same. Inside, nothing was. It felt as though someone had picked up my entire worldview, shaken it like a snow globe, then set it back down. The same pieces, a completely different picture. Somewhere along the way, I developed an unexpected appetite. Not for food, for ideas, history, philosophy, economics, politics. Anything that tried to explain why people built societies the way they did. I read everything I could get my hands on. Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, Fukuyama, Gorbachev, even Marx and Lenin. I survived all of them, though I can't honestly say they all survived me. I signed up for library cards, downloaded books by the dozens, read late into the night. Little by little, new thoughts began to appear about freedom, democracy, justice, property, progress. The strange thing was, the more I read the great philosophers and political thinkers, the less certain I became that any of them had the whole picture. There was no one I could really talk to, but it seemed like a shame to throw those thoughts away. So my fingers did what fingers have always done. They reached for a pen. The pen reached for paper. I bought a stack of notebooks and started writing. The connections kept happening. I noted each one carefully. Nothing more. No tricks, no performances, no making the evening news any stranger than it already was. I did notice something else. There was definitely a pattern to the contacts, some hidden rhythm. But I no longer cared enough to chase it. Let Tregebov and Shestopolov lose sleep over that, I told myself. They're the ones who'll get chewed out if they miss something. I have to admit, that thought made me smile. As the notebooks filled up, the ideas became clearer. Separate observations slowly connected into something larger. Patterns, relationships, principles that seemed to govern people, history, and power in ways I'd never noticed before. Mind you, I'd studied dialectical materialism, political economy, scientific communism, passed every exam. Barely. Still, old Hegel got one thing absolutely right. At some point, quantity really does become quality. In my case, that quality turned out to be exactly a page and a half. I gave it an absurdly ambitious title, The Manifesto of a New World. Not one word less, not one word more.
That would have been fine by itself. A manifesto is just a manifesto. It sits there quietly. Doesn't ask to be fed, doesn't bother anybody. The problem was, my brain had already come up with a plan.
I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. All I needed was another connection. Not just any connection, a big one. A live broadcast, something the whole country would be watching. So I waited patiently. The manuscript never left my side. Just to be safe, I printed 6 copies and tucked them into the pockets of every jacket and coat I owned.
You never know when history decides to knock. It knocked about 30 minutes into the president's annual press conference. The silver bells, the dizziness, the warm waves spreading across my chest. There it was, the connection. I happened to be home that day, using up some overtime. Perfect timing. He wasn't going anywhere. Those press conferences usually lasted for hours.
I stood up, picked up my manifesto. "Here goes," I whispered. On television, the president paused, took a sip of water, almost as if he were waiting. I began. "My fellow citizens." The president looked away from the teleprompter. "My fellow citizens," he repeated. "At this critical moment, I dictated to the highest office in the land. And at that very critical moment, my front door exploded inward. Literally. A breach team had blown it off its hinges. The apartment filled with armed men. Someone slammed me to the floor. A black hood came down over my head. Then I felt the sharp sting of a needle in my arm. Darkness. When I woke up, I was in what could generously be described as a cell. A very comfortable one, about the size of a decent one-bedroom apartment. No kitchen, but there was furniture, a bathroom, a television, gray walls, a heavy steel door locked from the outside. The windows were covered with some kind of fine metal mesh. It looked delicate. I had a feeling it could stop a rocket launcher. This time, there were no rules for waiting lying on the table, no welcoming brochure, no explanations. Needless to say, nobody had returned my phone. The television offered exactly 4 channels. It felt like the Soviet Union had finally caught up with the 21st century. Apparently, I'd been transferred to some kind of research facility. I suspected this was where my dear friends Tregyubov and Shestopolov actually worked. The guards were impressive. Polite, but impressive. Every single one of them looked like he'd been assembled from spare refrigerator parts. Huge shoulders, no neck to speak of. They moved almost silently. One would suddenly appear in the doorway, clear his throat so gently it somehow startled me every single time, and murmur, "Procedures, sir, if you would." That was usually the longest conversation we'd have. They looked at me with the patient expression adults reserve for children who've managed to glue themselves to the ceiling. That's when I truly understood what it meant to become a laboratory animal. Every day they escorted me into another lab. They examined everything: hair, eyes, blood, toenails. If it could be measured, they measured it. Electrodes ended up attached to places I hadn't previously considered electrically active. Yes, including the place you're thinking of. CT scanners and MRIs, those were just the warm-up acts.
They shoved me into machines that looked as though they'd been borrowed from science fiction movies. I spent hours inside a hyperbaric chamber, hours floating underwater in a testing pool.
Balanced on one foot while counting aloud toward 1,000,000, with wires hanging off every inch of me. They played music, flashed lights, scanned me, blew air at me, washed me, shook me, poked me, folded me into positions no 65-year-old should ever experience. At one point, they even put me in a coffin. I'm not making that up.
From time to time, the connection returned. By now, I recognized it instantly. The warm wave, the silver bells. Only now, there was something new. Behind the bells, somewhere deep in the imaginary orchestra pit, a string quartet seemed to be tuning up. One long violin note, sliding just a little higher, then a little lower, searching for perfect pitch. Whenever I heard that, I knew the connection was live.
I'd switch on the television immediately. Maybe the president was speaking somewhere, opening another bridge, attending another forum. Anything live would do. Twice I caught him. Well, caught isn't exactly the right word.
The first time, it was another conference. I honestly couldn't tell you what it was about. Blue stage, blue backdrop, the usual rows of serious-looking officials pretending to enjoy themselves. There he stood, behind the lectern, feet shoulder-width apart, talking. I scratched my nose. Nothing. Pulled on my ear. Still nothing. The connection was definitely there, but the imitation was gone. I slipped my hand into my back pocket. Nothing. He never moved. What the hell? I muttered. Now I was annoyed. I stuck my tongue out at the television. He calmly kept delivering another grand speech about patriotism, sacrifice, and the sacred duty of serving the nation. I escalated, made faces, did a little dance, even attempted a handstand. After all, I'd threatened to do exactly that once. Nothing. Not a twitch. He just kept exposing the enemies of the nation and outlining a glorious future. The second time happened during a live visit from one of those endlessly cheerful African presidents. I started gently, just enough to test the connection without embarrassing my mental brother. Hand in the pocket, scratch one leg with the other, straighten my hair. Nothing. It was as though we'd never been connected at all, as though the man on television had never heard of me. I was just about ready to do something truly juvenile, moon the television maybe, when my door opened, quietly. My personal giant squeezed himself inside. He didn't say a word, just wagged one enormous finger. Don't behave. That was enough. I realized they'd somehow detected the connection and figured out how to block it. At least, that's what I believed. As it turned out, the explanation was something entirely different. One day, my own private giant and I were walking back from another round of tests. Corridors, elevators, endless gray hallways. The place seemed determined to make every floor look exactly like every other floor. Whenever my escort heard footsteps somewhere ahead, his hand would immediately settle on my shoulder. Firm, almost polite. His silent way of saying, "Not your business, keep moving."
Then something went wrong. Or right. Depends how you look at it.
We stepped out of an elevator. At least, I think we were stepping out. The doors slid open, and right there, walking across the corridor, surrounded by 2 bodyguards, head slightly lowered, was him, the champion of my strange little universe, the president. There wasn't the slightest doubt. The warmth rushed through my chest. The silver bells began ringing again. He walked past without turning his head. But just for an instant, I thought I saw his eyes shift sideways toward me. Maybe he'd seen me too. Or maybe I only imagined it.